I'm Dr. Anthony Clark, and I'm a professor of Chinese history, specialized in the history of Catholic Christianity in China. And this series is about the Catholic martyr saints who died in China, sometimes called the Middle Kingdom. It is perhaps a stretch that the famous Saint Don Bosco ever imagined later Salesians traveling to China to continue his work there. He had tried to establish a school in Hong Kong during his lifetime, but there were too many obstacles. The kind and generous Father Bosco loved children, and in a dream he is reported to have had when only 9 years old, the Blessed Virgin said to him, "Transform my young children from wild animals to gentle lambs." Every country has children, and where there are children to raise in the faith of the Church, the Salesians have gone. China too has children, lots of them. And the first Salesian to make his way to the Middle Kingdom was the Italian missionary Luigi Versiglia, who went there to make gentle lambs of Mary's little children in the Far East. Versiglia went to China in 1906, 18 years after St. Don Bosco had died in his native Italy. When St. Versiglia led the first Salesian mission to China, he carried with him the traditional motto of the order, a quote from Don Bosco himself, "Da mihi animas cetera tolle," "Give me souls, take everything else away." It was ultimately for souls that Versiglia traveled to the Middle Kingdom. And once he arrived, he discovered how important his mission was. There are two Salesian martyr saints who died in China, Saint Luigi Versiglia and Saint Callisto Caravaggio. They both died together in 1930 because they stood in the way of bandits who wanted to take away the young women in their group. They had lived holy lives, and they died holy deaths in defense of the young. Salesians understand very well that children are the future of the Church, as Pope John Paul II has said many times. Nourished by the graces of their faith in Jesus and his mother, the Salesian martyrs of China gave their lives as a witness to the Middle Kingdom. They demonstrated through example the words of St. John Bosco, who said, "Trust all things to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament and to Mary, help of Christians, and you will see what miracles are." The Salesians, especially those on foreign missions, sometimes recall a dream handed down by the first followers of Don Bosco of two chalices lifted up in the sky. One cup was filled with the sweat of labor, and the other with the blood of Salesians who had suffered persecution. This was a sign to them of future martyrdom, and China fulfilled this expectation. After the violent massacres of Christians during the Boxer Uprising of 1900 had ended, a new wave of Catholic missionaries flooded into China, and one of the new orders looking to Christianize the Middle Kingdom was the Society of St. Francis de Sales, more commonly today called the Salesians of Don Bosco. This time was also during the politically turbulent period between the collapse of the Qing Empire and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And into this era of civil conflict between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong, Luigi Versiglia and Callisto Caravaggio began their missionary work in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong. The first of these two Salesian martyrs to arrive at China was Luigi Versiglia. He was born on June 5, 1873, at the small village of Olivegesi in the northern Italian province of Pavia. Luigi entered Don Bosco's oratory when he was only 12, and under the influence of Don Bosco himself, he began to consider the priesthood. He entered the Salesians in 1889 and was at last ordained a priest in 1895. He also earned his doctorate in philosophy from the esteemed Gregorian University, founded by the great Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Versiglia was only 22 when he became a priest, and when he was 23, he was made the novice master at Genzano di Roma, where he remained for a decade. One of the novices under his care described Father Versiglia as a very demanding master. The novice said that he was a padded hammer with those who showed a tendency to laziness. But Luigi Versiglia, despite his love for the novices and his wisdom in guiding them, always felt called to serve the young of another country on a foreign mission. He used to tell his superiors, "My trunk can be ready at a minute's notice." And to prepare himself for the rigors of missionary life, he maintained an active schedule of physical exercise and horseback riding on the Alban Hills southeast of Rome. In 1905, he received the news he had prayed for. He was to be sent to China to establish a Salesian presence there. Father Versiglia was put in charge of the first Salesian mission to Asia, and by the beginning of 1906, he was in Macau, adjusting to life in the East. He had to learn how to eat with chopsticks and learn to read and speak Chinese. At Macau, Luigi established a school and an orphanage, which functioned then as the mother house for the Salesian mission. St. Don Bosco's dream to have a mission for children in Asia was finally a reality. In 1917, the Vatican offered the Salesians an area in southern China at Shaozhou in Guangdong. Father Versiglia arranged for an expedition to Shaozhou the following year under the leadership of Father Santegurelli. And just 3 days before this first group of sons of St. John Bosco left for China, Cardinal Giovanni Cagliero gave the Salesians a farewell sermon. He said, quote, "What last words shall I give you in particular? The words that Don Bosco gave me and my companions at the first expedition of 1875. Look for souls, not for money or fame or honors. Take special care of the children, the poor, the aged, the sick, and you will gain the blessing of God and the goodwill of men. Recommend and spread constantly the devotion to Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament and to Mary, help of Christians, and you will see what miracles are." And at the dinner party afterward, Father Gurelli gave Versiglia a gift that had been sent to him from the rector major of the mission. It was a chalice. One of the priests at the dinner overheard Father Versiglia's response when he received the beautiful cup. Versiglia said, "You brought me a chalice, and I accept it." Don Bosco saw that the Asian missions would flourish when a chalice would be filled with the blood of his sons. This chalice was sent to me, and I will have to fill it. The Holy See formally made the Salesian mission at Shaozhou a vicariate apostolic in 1920, and Luigi Versiglia was made its first bishop. He was ordained a bishop at the cathedral in Guangdong, and one of the hymns was a song about Adam. The words go, "We are sons of an unfortunate father." Well, the new bishop noticed the words and said to his confreres with a smile, "Yes, I may be a miserable father, but I shall do my best to be a good father." And once Versiglia was made a bishop, he set himself to a fatiguing schedule of work. Bishop Versiglia established an orphanage for abandoned children, a home for the elderly, and a Salesian seminary. He was skilled at anything he put his mind to, and it seems that his mind was on everything. He was the mission printer, the sacristan, the gardener, the painter, and he even cut hair as the mission barber. In 1921, he traveled back to Italy, where he met the young and passionate Callisto Caravaggio at Turin. Callisto wanted to go to China, and I think Versiglia needed the help. Caravaggio was born on June 18, 1903, in the small northwestern Italian town of Corne, not too far from Turin. Young Callisto was educated by the Salesians and made a promise to God to serve on a foreign mission. He became a novice in 1918 and met Bishop Luigi Versiglia in 1921 when Luigi was in Italy. The young seminarian told the bishop, "I will come and see you in China." He kept his promise, both to God and to Versiglia. In 1924, Caravaggio went to Macau to begin studying the difficult language of Chinese. The mainland at that time was fractured between two opposing ideologies: the pseudo-republican faction under Chiang Kai-shek and the atheist communism of Mao Zedong. In a letter written by Bishop Versiglia in 1926, he wrote that we are now completely under communist control, and we don't know how things will turn out. Guangzhou was increasingly in the hands of communist forces, and it was into this turbulent landscape that Callisto arrived in March of 1929. Not long after his arrival, Bishop Versiglia ordained Callisto a priest, and the new priest wrote his mother a letter telling her how committed he must be to his new duties. He said, "Having a priest as your child is a great honor, and the Lord in heaven will reward you for all of your sacrifices made for love." The letter seems almost like an attempt to prepare his mother for a future loss. But as his letter was making its way to his home in Italy, local tensions in Shaozhou grew more dangerous. After his ordination, Bishop Versiglia assigned Father Caravaggio to the city of Linzhou, where he zealously worked to expand his small community of Christians. After only 6 months at his modest little mission, Callisto traveled to Shaozhou to give a report to his bishop, Versiglia, who was so happy with the news that he decided to return to Linzhou with Caravaggio to see the mission church himself. Linzhou was a 2-day journey from Shaozhou. The first day was to be made by train, and the second day by boat. This was sadly their final trip. They never arrived. The two Salesians were traveling with several other passengers on their way to Callisto's mission at Linzhou, including 4 young teachers from their school, 2 women and 2 men, and a young female student who was around 10 years old. On the second day of their journey, February 25th, 1930, they traveled by boat, and a large white flag was hoisted above the boat with the words Catholic Mission. They thought that this would protect them from any mischief, but they were, I guess, a bit too naive. An ambush had been prepared for the unfortunate passengers. A band of men ensconced themselves within a bamboo grove along the shore at an area called Litouju, and they waited for the boat to pass by. The ambushers consisted of around a dozen men. Some were bandits, some were communist soldiers, and one man had previously asked one of the women on the boat to marry him. This man was still very bitter. She had refused to marry him because she intended to enter a convent and become a nun to dedicate herself to God. He hoped to abduct her and induce the poor woman to marry him anyway. It was on a Tuesday at around noon that their boat made its way past the bamboo grove, floating calmly on the Linzhou River. Suddenly, the men emerged from the grove with rifles pointed at the boat. "Stop!" one of the bandits yelled, and the terrified boat captain maneuvered his vessel toward the shore. Bishop Versiglia had been assaulted by bandits before. He had been captured and set free after giving the men everything he had. So he was not at that time overly concerned that this would be any different. But alas, this time was different. The men required 500 cash, a lot of money then. They demanded it immediately. And when they saw the Chinese women on the boat, they also demanded that the girls be handed over. Well, Bishop Versiglia knew very well that if the men took the women, they would be raped and most likely sold into arranged marriages or even slavery. He began frantically to bargain with them, but as he spoke, the bandits swiftly boarded the boat and dashed toward the girls. Bishop Versiglia and Father Carvario blocked their approach with their bodies, but were not prepared for the brutality of their attackers. Desperate to save the young Christian women from violation and abuse, the two unarmed priests confronted the attackers. It was courageous, but useless. Using their rifle butts, the bandits horribly beat the two Salesians, striking their arms, bodies, and heads, and the two priests fell to the ground, nearly unconscious. As he fell, Father Carvario intoned the names Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and even as they lay wounded on the ground, Versiglia and Carvario grabbed the feet of the women, trying to save them from their assailants. But in the end, the women were abducted and the two saints were dragged ashore. Once ashore, they were searched and physically abused, but worst of all to them, they were helpless to save the women from their fate with the bandits. One of the men in the group shouted at them, "If we win, we will destroy all religion in China, and no one will study your beliefs again." This man was undoubtedly one of the communist soldiers in the band. While the priests were being pulled to the riverbank, some of the bandits hunted through the boat for money, but they mostly found sacred objects for devotions or liturgy. These things were all burned. The men again dragged the two priests a little further from the boat into a thicket. There were several witnesses who overheard the entire episode unfold. Bishop Versiglia pleaded on Carvario's behalf. "I am an old man," he said, "so kill me if you want. Only let him go. He's still very young." Regardless of the bishop's entreaty to spare Father Carvario, the two missionaries were taken into the brush. A moment later, the witnesses heard 5 quick rifle shots, and they knew the two men were dead. News of the attack reached the local authorities that afternoon around 2 o'clock, and official soldiers were alerted about what had happened. One of the women who was on the boat, Mary, had been able to escape and report on precisely what she saw. When all this happened, we were only about 9 feet from the missionaries. I saw Father Carvario bow his head and speak softly to the bishop, as if they were confessing to each other. Then the bishop and Father Carvario looked at us. They pointed toward the sky, and they prayed aloud. While Mary recounted the horrible murder of the two priests, another priest, Father Cavada, rushed to find the bodies of his priest brothers. He was accompanied by the chief of police. Versiglia and Carvario had been shot, and their heads were beaten in a dreadful act of violence against them. Their remains were respectfully gathered by Father Cavada and taken back to the mission. The other women were taken to the bandits' hideaway at a nearby mountain, and they suffered torments there for several days before the local authorities liberated them. The freed victims were taken to the police headquarters, where they were looked after until they recovered from their terrible trauma. On the night of March 2nd, a Sunday, The girls went to visit the bodies of the two holy men who had died because they tried to save them from the bandits. The women knelt beside the remains of the two sons of Saint Don Bosco and prayed in thanksgiving for their holy example of self-sacrifice. One of the killers was overheard saying to another how surprised he was that the two foreign devils, as they called them, displayed no fear as they were being beaten and killed, but only continued to pray peacefully. I have studied all of the canonized martyrs of China, and this sense of peacefulness was quite common as they faced death. At that critical moment, they appeared to be quite eager to die and meet God. After all, we read in Holy Scripture, "Fear none of those things which you shall suffer, for I will give you a crown of life." The bodies of Saints Luigi Versiglia and Callisto Caravaggio were officially identified by the local Chinese authorities on March 4th. They were placed into coffins and prepared for a solemn Catholic burial. A requiem mass was celebrated on March 13th, and their remains were suitably buried in the presence of representatives of the local government. Bishops, priests, and a crowd of faithful Christians and non-Christians of the area regarded these two Salesians as heroes who died defending the honor of young Chinese women. The men who killed them were, in fact, never tried. That is, they were never found. And during the Cultural Revolution in 1966, Chairman Mao's Red Guards destroyed the graves of the two Salesian martyrs buried in Guangzhou, and their relics in China completely disappeared. Actually, many, perhaps most, Catholic graveyards in China were desecrated by Red Guards during that time. Yet, as we have seen throughout this series, martyrdom is never an end, but always marks the beginning of a renewed testimony for the truths of our Christian faith. The Salesian mission in China continued for a while after Versiglia and Caravaggio had died, though not without new struggles. As I've said, this was the time when communism was rising to political dominance in China. The sons of St. John Bosco re-established a mission in Beijing in 1946. But in 1949, Chairman Mao Zedong proclaimed the beginning of the People's Republic of China. And as we know, Karl Marx left little room in his intellectual paradigm for belief in God, especially a belief attached to an institutionalized church such as Roman Catholicism. As soon as China was officially communist, many Salesians were arrested and put into state labor camps. There were several excuses for these arrests, all of them contrived. Foreign missionaries were quickly expelled from China during the first years of communist rule, and by 1954, there were only 21 Salesians left in mainland China. As one source states, the years of the Church of Silence had begun. Today, the Sons of Don Bosco can only operate officially in Hong Kong and Taiwan, where they manage 8 educational and cultural centers in the spirit of their holy founder. At the solemn beatification of Bishop Luigi Versiglia and Father Callisto Caravaggio on May 15, 1983, the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, delivered a very stirring homily at St. Peter's in Rome, extolling the heroic virtues of these two courageous missionaries. In his comments, the Holy Father spoke of Christ's assertion that there is no greater love than this, than to lay down one's own life for another. Versiglia and Caravaggio thus put into practice the greatest form of love possible. In fact, it is that same kind of love that was given to all people by Christ himself when he died on his cross. The Pope also recalled that the small group on the boat that day was attacked at noon just after the two saints had led the other Christians in the recitation of the Angelus, which the Holy Father calls the sweet prayer that prepares us for the victorious struggle against the snares of evil. In his concluding remarks, Pope John Paul II exhorted all Christians to consider their own journey towards holiness in imitation of their examples in China. The Pope also noted how their heroic sacrifices reflect well the Christian dedication of the Salesian brothers, but he also reminded us all that the examples of saints are not just for a few people, but rather for the entire church. As the Holy Father said, Christ gave us His Spirit so that we can succeed in this. Blessed Mary, help of Christians, assist us to be like Versiglia and Caravaggio.